By the summer of 1883, Clint Dalton's ranch was eating itself alive, the crew so worn down that a fence post took 2 men to lift. Then a Japanese woman named Suzu stepped off the supply wagon with a lacquered box she wouldn't let anyone touch, hired on as his cook, and started feeding the whole outfit out of one iron pot. Within a month, the men who could barely sit a horse were outworking boys half their age, and Clint, who had been coughing blood into his kerchief by lantern light, was lifting hay bales the crew used to drag 2 at a time. The town called it a miracle, and the rival who wanted Clint's land cheap called it something worse. Not one of them knew what Suzu was putting in the pot, because she never told a soul. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan turned a dying ranch into the strongest outfit in the territory without once raising her voice. The Bardee sat in a long valley where the grass had gone thin and the creek ran low, and by the summer of 1883, the place had started to look like a man who had given up on himself. Fence wire rested where it met the posts. The barn roof sagged at the south corner, and nobody had the strength or the will to jack it back up. Clint Dalton walked the yard at dusk and counted what was left, and the count never came out in his favor. He had been running the spread alone since his wife died 2 seasons back, and the work had eaten him down to the bone. The crew was 4 men, and they were running on the same fuel the whole territory ran on. Salt pork and beans, 3 meals running. Sourdough biscuits when someone remembered to keep the starter alive. And coffee strong enough to strip a spoon. The chuck wagon turned out the same heavy food day after day, and it kept the men on their feet, but it didn't build them back up. Fresh greens were a thing they remembered from somewhere else. On the range, a man ate what kept, and what kept was salt and dried beans and fat, and a body could only hold out so long on that. Jed was the youngest hand, barely 20, and he had a cut on his forearm from a wire roll that wouldn't close. He kept it wrapped in a rag and kept working, because that was the only choice a man had out here. The other 3 were older, slower, and they moved through the days like men walking uphill in deep sand, and the work that should have taken the morning took them through to dark. They didn't complain, because complaining was a kind of asking, and asking was a kind of admitting, and no man on the Bardee could afford either one. Clint watched them from the porch and knew the look because he wore it himself. He was 34 years old, and he moved like a man. 10 years past that, and some mornings the cough that lived in his chest brought up something dark into his kerchief, and he folded the cloth over before anyone could see. The ranch had been a good one once, before the fever took his wife, and the drought took the grass, and the bank took the loan money he couldn't pay back. Clint had built the Bardee out of nothing, married her on the porch the year the creek ran high, and now he was watching it come apart the way a man watches a house burn when he has no water left to throw. The pride that had built the place was the same pride that was sinking it, because he wouldn't take help, and he wouldn't sell cheap, and he wouldn't admit that a man alone on a ranch this size was a man with 1 foot in the river. He hid it because hiding was the only kind of pride he had left. The kerosene lantern on the kitchen table threw a flickering amber light across the room when he sat down to go over the books, and in that unsteady glow the blood on the cloth looked black, and he told himself it was nothing. The ranch was dying, and he was dying with it, and he couldn't say which one was taking the other down. The trouble had a name, and the name was Harlan Voss. Voss ran the big spread up the valley, the one with the new fences and the hired guns and the water rights he had been buying up one creek at a time. He had made Clint an offer on the Bardee 3 times now, and the offer had been low each time because Voss didn't pay full price for a man he expected to fail. Clint had refused each time, and the last time Voss had smiled in a way that meant he would wait because winter would do his work for him. The ranch was eating itself, and Boss was the man standing outside the door with a deed in his pocket, and the only question left was whether the Bar D would last the season. The supply wagon came up the valley road on a Thursday, and the driver had a woman sitting on the bench beside him who didn't look like anyone the crew had ever seen. She was small-framed and carried herself straight, and when she stepped down onto the packed dirt of the yard, she moved with a stillness that made the men stop what they were doing and watch. Her hair was jet black and pulled back tight, and her face was all sharp lines, high cheekbones, and a narrow jaw, and eyes so dark they looked black in the afternoon light. She held a lacquered box against her ribs with one hand and a cloth bundle of dried goods with the other, and she didn't speak until someone spoke to her. The crew couldn't place her. One of them called her the wrong name, the name of a country that wasn't hers, and she didn't correct him. She had learned long ago not to spend herself correcting people who weren't really asking. Her name was Suzu, and she had come a long way to stand in this yard, and the distance she had traveled wasn't the kind measured in miles. Clint came off the porch and looked her over the way he looked over a horse, which was rude and which she allowed because she needed the work, and he needed someone who wouldn't quit. He had put an ad in the territorial paper for a cook because the last one had walked off in the spring, and the crew had been boiling their own beans ever since, and the beans had nearly killed the will out of them. He asked her where she had learned to cook, and she told him she had learned from her grandmother in Kyoto in the old way, and that she knew food and she knew medicine, and that on a place like this, the two were the same thing. He didn't know what Kyoto was. He heard the word medicine, and his face went hard because a man who is sick doesn't want the word said out loud in his own yard. She didn't argue, but asked to see the kitchen and the stores, and he showed her, and she stood in the doorway of the low cookhouse and looked at the sacks of beans and the slab of salt pork and the tin of flour, and said nothing for a long time. Then she set the lacquer box on the high shelf above the stove, and she told him plainly that no one was to open it. He asked her why. She said it held her family's tools, and it was hers, and that was the only answer she gave. The box was the color of dark honey, and the latch was brass, and it caught the light from the stove in a way that made it hard to stop looking at. She cooked one meal without being asked and without being hired, and the crew ate it clean off the plates, and that was the first clean plate the Bar D had seen in months. Clint watched them eat and said nothing, because the food was good and he was too proud to say so. He hired her on the spot for room and board and a small wage, and he did it by leaving the wage on the kitchen table and walking out, which was the closest thing to thanks he knew how to give. The crew watched her settle in that first night, the way she moved through the cookhouse as if she had always been there, and the way the lacquered box sat on its shelf like it owned the room, and not one of them knew what to make of her, and not one of them could stop watching. Suzu took the measure of the stores the way a doctor takes the measure of a man, and what she found was a body of work that was starving in a specific way. The food was heavy, and it was enough to keep a man upright, but it was narrow, the same few things turned over and over, and nothing in it that helped a body close a wound or build a bone back. Jed's arm was still open after a week. Clint's cough was getting worse in the nights, and she could hear it through the wall of the cookhouse, and she knew the sound of a chest that was giving out. She didn't ask permission because she had already learned that the men here would say no to anything they didn't recognize, and she couldn't afford to be sent away before she had done any good, so she started quietly. She rendered a broth from the beef bones the crew had been throwing to the dogs, and she added dried seaweed from her own bundle, and the broth came out dark and thick, and she folded it into the bean stew, so the taste of it was hidden under the salt and the smoke. She grated ginger root into the coffee pot before each meal, because the root warmed the gut and moved the blood, and the men drank their coffee and didn't know what had changed. Behind the chuck wagon, where no one looked, she set a jar of soybeans to ferment. The beans had been drying in her bundle since the coast, and she had started them with the culture her grandmother had taught her to keep alive the way a woman keeps a fire. The smell when the ferment took was sharp and strange, and she kept the jar covered and waited for it to come right, because the ferment was the thing that built a body back from the inside, and it took its own time and couldn't be rushed. The first real meal under her hand was a stew with the bone broth folded through it and the ginger and the coffee, and the crew ate it and didn't ask questions. And that night, for the first time in months, every man on the place slept straight through without the griping in his belly that had become as ordinary as the sun going down. Clint noticed the food was different and said nothing about it because it was good, and because admitting he needed a thing was harder for him than doing without it. He ate 2 bowls and pushed back from the table and looked at the cookhouse door where she had gone out, and the look on his face was the kind the man wears when he knows he's being helped and can't make himself say so. She was already changing what they ate, and she was doing it without telling them why, because she was certain they would refuse if she named any of it, and she wasn't wrong. The care was real, and the lie was real, and they both lived in the same pot. And a pot like that doesn't stay covered forever. She thought about her grandmother at night sometimes, the old woman who had taught her that food was the first medicine and the last one, and how her grandmother had never asked a patient's permission to heal him because the asking would have cost the man his pride, and the pride was the part of him that was still fighting to live. Suzu had learned the medicine, and she had learned the lesson under it, and the lesson was that sometimes a body does the good and carries the weight of having done it without being asked, and doesn't pretend the weight isn't there. After the crew turned in, Suzu worked by the light of the kerosene lamp, the flame throwing its amber flicker across the low table where she laid out her tools. She ground ginger root in a small stone mortar, and she measured dried ginseng from a paper packet, and she tended the jar of fermenting soybeans the way a woman tends a thing that's alive, because it was. These were the old ways, the medicine her grandmother had practiced in Kyoto before Suzu was born, and she had crossed an ocean carrying them in a cloth bundle and a lacquered box, and now they lived in a cookhouse on a dying ranch in a territory that had never heard of any of them. The secret wasn't one thing, it was a way of thinking about food, and it came out of her hands a dozen different ways. The fermenting soybeans, the ones the crew didn't know about, were the heart of it. She had learned them as natto, and she knew them as the strongest food her people had for building a body back, rich in the thing that put calcium into bone instead of letting it settle where it did no good, and heavy with protein, and with an enzyme that kept the blood moving clean. She folded it into the stew in amounts no one could taste, because the smell of it alone would have turned the men away, and she dosed it by meal and not by medicine, a little every day, the way a body actually heals. The broth was the second part. She made it from bones and seaweed and the fermented bean paste she carried. The paste her people called miso, and it did the work the salt pork couldn't do, which was to settle a gut and let it take in what the food carried. The plums she carried were the third. The salt-cured umeboshi she kept for the men who hit the wall in the middle of the day, because the plum cut the fatigue and put a man back on his feet the way no cup of coffee could. And the herbs, the ginger, and the ginseng were for stamina and for healing, and she gave them out by reading the man in front of her, the way her grandmother had read the people who came to the door in Kyoto. Jed got extra of the wound-healing herbs in his bowl because his arm wouldn't close, and she could see it. Clint got the bone-building ferment in his morning plate because she could hear the cough through the wall, and she knew what a chest like that that cost the man who still had to lift and haul. She watched each of them eat, and she learned what each one needed, and she gave it without being asked and without explaining, because the explaining would have undone the whole thing. This was the part that sat heavy on her. She was dosing grown men without their knowledge, men who had a right to know what went into their own bodies, and she was doing it because she was sure they would refuse if she told them, and she was sure they needed it, and she had decided that their need outweighed their right to decide. She wasn't comfortable with it, but she did it anyway because she had watched a ranch eat itself alive, and she knew what that looked like at the end, and she wasn't going to stand in a kitchen and let it happen while she waited for someone to ask her permission. The care was the truest thing in her, and the deception was the cost of it, and she carried both and didn't pretend either one was simple. There were nights the weight of it kept her awake, on her narrow cot in the cookhouse loft, the kerosene lamp turned low, the amber light moving on the ceiling the way water moves on a wall. She would lie there and listen to the cough through the boards and know she was doing the right thing the wrong way, and she would do it again in the morning. 3 weeks in, the change had moved past anything a man could ignore. Jed's arm had closed, the skin pulling together over the cut that had been open since the spring, and he unwrapped the rag and looked at it and didn't say anything, because he didn't have the words for what had happened. The hands who used to drag a fence post between two of them were lifting the posts alone, setting them and tamping them and moving on to the next, and the work that had been slipping all summer got done in half the days it used to take. The chuck wagon meals came out clean every night, the bowls scraped, and the men slept hard and woke ready. Clint was the one the territory couldn't stop talking about. The cough faded first, the deep wet sound that had lived in his chest all winter going quiet by degrees, until some mornings he didn't cough at all, and the kerchief he carried stayed folded and clean in his back pocket. He stopped spitting blood, and he didn't mark the day it happened, but Suzu marked it, because she had been listening for it. Then the strength came, and it came the way. Strength actually comes, not in a day, but in a steady build, a little more each morning, until the man who had been moving like a ghost of himself was hauling hay bales onto the wagon bed alone, the same bales the young hands used to struggle with, 2 at a time. The feed store owner in town was the first to ask what Clint was doing different, and Clint told him the truth, which was that he didn't know. He gave the credit to the new cook and let it go, because that was easier than admitting he had been dying and someone had pulled him back, but the question didn't let go of him. He started watching Suzu work, the way she moved through the cookhouse, the way she read the men before she fed them, the way she always seemed to know who needed what before they knew it themselves, and a suspicion grew in him that he didn't yet have the shape of. He could feel that something had changed in the food, and he couldn't name it. And the not being able to name it sat in him the way a splinter sits, small and sharp and working its way deeper. Voss heard the talk because Voss always heard the talk, and he rode down to the Bardee to size up the man he had been waiting to fail. What he found was a rancher who looked 10 years younger than the last time he had seen him. Standing straight in the yard with color in his face and a grip on the fence wire that said the hand wasn't going to slip. Voss sat his horse and looked at Clint a long time, and the patience he had been wearing all summer came off him like a coat, and what was underneath was cold. The low offer was a problem for Voss now, because Clint was no longer failing, and a man who is no longer failing is a man no one can buy for pennies. He rode out without making the offer again, and the way he rode out told Clint everything he needed to know about what was coming. The food was working, and the central promise of the place was being kept, and the crew was strong, and the ranch was holding, and all of that was true, and all of that had drawn the threat closer instead of pushing it away. Success on a failing ranch didn't make the wolves go home, it made them hungry. And the box on the high shelf was still closed, and the crew was still curious, and curiosity on a ranch with nothing to do at night, is a thing that finds a way to get itself fed. The box had been sitting on the high shelf for a month by then, and the crew had been talking about it for the whole month, the way men talk about a thing they aren't allowed to touch. It was the youngest hand, not Jed, but the other one, who let his curiosity get ahead of his fear one afternoon while Suzu was down at the well filling the buckets. He pulled a chair over and climbed up and took the box down and set it on the table and opened the brass latch, and what was inside stopped the breath in him. There were needles in a silk roll, fine and thin, so fine they caught no light at all, the kind of needle that isn't for sewing. Packets of dried herbs lay wrapped in paper, each one marked in characters he couldn't read. A small jar held the dark, sharp-smelling ferment he had caught a whiff of behind the chuck wagon and never placed, and there was a folded note in a hand that wasn't his language. He didn't understand any of it, but the needles told him a story, and the story they told him was that the woman feeding them was doing something to them that they hadn't agreed to. He brought the box to Jed, and Jed brought it to Clint, and by the time Suzu came back from the well with her buckets, the whole crew was standing in the cookhouse around the open box, and the room went quiet when she came through the door. She set the buckets down and looked at the box on the table, and then at the faces around it, and she understood in one breath what had happened and what it meant, and she didn't run, and she didn't explain, and she didn't beg. She stood with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she waited because she had learned long ago that a woman who explains before she's asked sounds like a woman who is lying even when she isn't. Clint set the box between them on the table and asked her, in a voice that wasn't loud but that carried the whole room, what the things were and what she had been doing with them. And she told him. She named each one plainly, the way she would have named it in Kyoto. The ferment was natto and a built bone. She called the paste miso, and it settled the gut and let a body take in its food. The plums were umeboshi, and they cut the fatigue that was wearing the men down. Ginger and ginseng were the herbs for stamina and for healing, and the needles were for the deep pains the herbs couldn't reach. She told him she had been putting them in the food for a month, and that she had hidden it because they would have refused, and she looked at him when she said it, and she didn't look away. She didn't apologize, because an apology would have been a lie. She wasn't sorry she had done it. She was only sorry she had had to do it in the dark, and those were two different things, and she wouldn't let him confuse them. She wasn't wrong about the refusing, and everyone in the room knew it, and that was the thing that made the moment so hard. The silence after she finished was the kind that has weight to it. Clint looked at the box, and then at her, and then at the crew, and the turning point wasn't a speech, it was a single action. He closed the box and set it back on the high shelf. He didn't thank her, and he didn't fire her, and he walked out of the cookhouse and left the door open behind him, and the silence he left behind did the work that words couldn't have done. The morning after, the crew was split down the middle, like a log that had been set on the block. Two of the hands wanted to leave, and they said so out loud in the yard, standing with their hats in their hands, and their reason was plain. They wouldn't eat food dosed by a woman they didn't know, with things they couldn't name, without their say in it, and they didn't care that the food had made them strong, because the strength wasn't the point. The point was that no one had asked them. Jed stayed. He stood by the corral and said nothing, but he stayed, and the arm that Suzu had healed hung easy at his side, and that was his whole answer. Clint sat with the decision through a long night, the kerosene lantern on the table throwing its steady amber light across the closed box on the shelf above him, and the light moved on the lacquer the way it had moved the first day she set it there. He wasn't deciding whether she was right, because he already knew she was right, and he already knew she was wrong, and both of those were true at the same time, and that was the thing that kept him in the chair until the lamp burned low. The real wound wasn't his body, which she had mended. The real wound was his pride, which had kept him from admitting he needed help while his ranch ate him alive. And she had seen that, and she had stepped over his pride to save him, and he didn't know whether to be grateful or furious, and so he was both, and so he sat. He found her at dawn, not in the cookhouse, but out by the corral, where she was watching the horses come awake in the early light, and he asked her one thing. He asked whether she would have told him if he had asked. She said yes. She said she had waited for him to ask, and he never had, because he was too proud to say he needed a thing, and so she had done the thing without the asking, and she told him that to his face, without raising her voice, and without dropping her eyes. It was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst that can happen, which in her case was being sent away from a place she had started to think of as home, and the calm was real, and he saw it, and it cost him something to see it. He made his choice in actions, not in words, and told the two hands they were free to go, and they went, and they took their gear and rode out down the valley road, and the Bardee watched them go. He told the men who stayed that the food stayed as it was, and that if any of them had a question about what was in it, they were to ask the cook to her face and not go climbing her shelves behind her back. The crew that stayed sat down to the morning meal. Jed asked Suzu out loud and in front of everyone what was in the stew that morning, and she told him, and he ate. The ranch was short-handed by 2 now, and that made everything harder. The fence work and the haying and the riding of the lines, and it made the thing that was coming harder too, because strength in 3 men isn't strength in 5, and Clint knew it. The moral weight of it didn't lift. She had been right that they would have refused, and she had been wrong to decide for them, and Clint held both of those in the same hand and didn't set either one down, because the story didn't let him. What he had learned in the night was that the pride he had carried like a second skeleton had been the thing killing him slower than the cough. The woman in his kitchen had seen that before he had, and she had stepped over it to save him. And he owed her for that, and he was angry at her for it in the same breath. He didn't know how to pay a debt like that, so he did the only thing he could, which was to keep her and to eat what she made and to stop pretending he didn't need it. Voss made his move on a Tuesday, and he made it at the water, because the water was the one thing the Bardee couldn't do without. He had been buying up the creek rights upstream all year, a piece at a time, the way a man buys a debt, and now he held enough of it to close the flow, and he rode down to the Bardee with 4 hired guns behind him to say so. He didn't come to the porch, but to the creek crossing and sat his horse there, and Clint came down to meet him with Jed and the 2 hands who had stayed, and the 4 of them stood in the dust and looked up at 5 men who meant to take the place by starving it. Voss gave him the terms the way a man gives terms when he knows he has already won. Sell the Bardee for the old low price, or watch the herd go dry by midsummer when the dam went in. He didn't threaten guns because he didn't need guns. He had the water, and the water was enough, and he said it with the patience of a man who has time on his side. He let his eyes move over the place, the new fence posts, and the strong cattle, and the cookhouse with its smoke going straight up, and Clint could see him recalculating, because the ranch he had come to pick clean was no longer the ranch he had been watching die all year. Clint refused the way a man refuses when he has nothing left to trade, short and flat, and without any room in it. Voss took the measure of him and rode out, and on the way out he said he would be back with more men, and the men wouldn't be carrying deeds. The ranch was short-handed, and the threat was real, and the clock was running, and in that stretch Suzu's part shifted from the cook to something else, though she didn't leave the kitchen to do it. She went through the men's old injuries, the ones that had never healed, right the bad knee and the shoulder that slipped, and she worked on them with the needles and the herbs so the men could ride hard and work hard when the time came. She didn't fight and she didn't pretend she would, but she made the men who would fight able to fight, and that was its own kind of weapon. Then she showed Clint the naginata. It was a long-bladed pole, the blade curved at the end, and it had come across the ocean wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her bundle, and she hadn't spoken of it. She set it across the table in the cookhouse and told him it had been her grandmother's in Kyoto, and that the women of her family had kept it for the protecting of a home, and that she would stand with it if the home she had built here was threatened. He hadn't expected that. He looked at the blade and then at her, and for the first time since she had come, he understood that she wasn't staying out of the fight because she was afraid. She was staying out of it because her part was to keep the house standing while the men held the line, and the part she had chosen was the harder one. The tension pulled tight as a wire. Voss would come at dawn with numbers, and Clint had 3 hands and a cook and a long blade that wasn't his, and the food had made them strong, but strength against 4 guns is still a gamble, and the night before the dawn was long. The dawn comes up gray over the creek, and Voss rides in with 6 men this time, not 4, and the hooves on the hard ground sound like something counting down. Clint meets him at the crossing with Jed in the 2 hands, and Suzu stands behind them with the naginata held low, and the stillness she holds it with makes the hired guns look at her a second time and then a third, because a woman who doesn't move when she should be afraid is a thing a man can't read, and the not reading is what slows him. Voss gives the word one more time. He wants the deed, and he says it loud enough that the creek can hear it, and Clint says no, and the no is the last word that passes between them. Voss nods at his men to ride for the dam, and Clint's crew moves to cut them off, and the first shove at the water's edge turns into a brawl, the kind of close fight where strength and footing are everything. And the men who have been eating Suzu's food for a month are strong and quick, and they hold the line against the riders in a way they couldn't have held it in the spring. Clint and Voss face each other alone in the shallows. Voss is the bigger man and the meaner one, and he has done this before, taken a spread by putting its owner in the dirt, and he comes in hard and sure, swinging with the weight of a man who has never had to pay for the damage he does. Clint isn't the man he was in the spring. The body that was failing him has been rebuilt 1 meal at a time by a woman he almost sent away, and he isn't faster than Voss, but he's longer, and he doesn't break, and the fight goes down into the water and stays there. It isn't pretty, and it isn't quick. Voss lands a blow that would have put the old Clint on his back, and the new Clint takes it and stays on his feet and comes back. And the surprise on Voss's face is the first thing that has gone wrong for him all year. Clint puts Voss down in the creek and holds him there, the cold water running over them both, and he holds him under until the man stops fighting and yields the water claim, and then he lets him up, and Voss comes out of the creek, wet and beaten, and rides out with his men behind him, and the dam doesn't get built. The strength came from the food, and the food came from the woman he had decided to keep, and the ranch held because of both of those things, and in spite of the cost of them, the victory isn't clean. 2 hands are gone, and the deception stands where it stood. Clint won the creek because Suzu decided for him before he could decide for himself, and that's the truth of it, and it's a truth that doesn't sit easy, and it isn't meant to. Suzu doesn't celebrate. She goes back to the cookhouse and starts the noon meal, the way she has started every meal for a month, and the box stays on the high shelf, but the latch is open now, and the light from the door moves across it. The noon meal is on the table, and Clint sits down to it, and for the first time he asks Suzu, to her face and in front of the crew, what is in the bowl. She tells him. He keeps eating. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.